Building. This is an event part of the Global Governance Forum organized by the Stimson Center. My name is Massimo Tommasoli. I'm the permanent observer for international IDEA to the UN, and today's event will address the issue of reinventing the role of international and regional organizations in promoting peaceful, just, and inclusive institutions in times of crisis. What was done and what is next. We'll have a very tight agenda. We have representatives from all these partner institutions. I will shortly introduce them. But before further ado, I would like to give the floor to Kevin Casas Zamora, who is the Secretary General of International IDEA, for his welcoming remarks. Kevin, you have the floor. It seems that we are facing some technical problems with the connection by allowing Kevin to speak. Okay, I think now we are probably almost through. I hope that we can now start with the welcoming opening remarks by Kevin Casas Zamora, the Secretary General of International IDEA.
Can you hear me well now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Massimo, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining this event from. I'm excited to be part of this event, which to a great extent is part of International IDEA's 25th anniversary celebrations, but which also coincides with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And also with International Democracy Day, which, as you all know, was this week. I would like to start by thanking the Stimson Center for making this a part of the UN75 Global Governance Forum. And also, I would like to thank our strategic partners, colleagues, and friends, the global and regional organizations, for joining us in today's conversation. We are very honored and pleased to have high-level representatives from the African Union, ASEAN, the Community of Democracies, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, and the United Nations. Today's discussion couldn't be more urgent and for months now, we have borne witness to the devastating consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and the inability of the national, international, and multilateral system to respond in an effective, coordinated, and collaborative way. Paradoxically, the most serious global economic, social, and political crisis of the Second World War, far from consolidating global support for multilateralism, has multiplied doubts about the capacity of international institutions to inspire, shape, and support recovery strategies and plans. In many ways, the pandemic exposed the pre-existing ills and deep-rooted fragilities of the systems upon which our development is grounded, both on a global and national level. On the multilateral and international level, there is, quite frankly, some serious soul-searching to do. This is a pandemic that the international community has been unable to prevent and properly contain, despite the multiple warnings it refused to heed in the recent past, and the lessons that previous smaller crises yielded. And we have seen, at least initially, the opposite of a common, coordinated, and concerted approach, which is the only way to deal with global and transnational challenges. On a national level, the crisis has revealed substantial shortcomings when it comes to basic infrastructures, delivery systems, particularly in the health and education sectors, social protection platforms, job creation mechanisms, emergency readiness. In all these policy areas, the pandemic has shaken the foundations of our societies. It has affected trust in public institutions and their effectiveness in responding to unprecedented global challenges. And the results are already in. And here I'm just going to focus a little bit for a second on the economic devastation. I mean, let's leave aside for a second the calamitous public health consequences that we are seeing all over the place. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the most unequal region in the world, the pandemic is having truly devastating social and economic implications. ECLAC is estimating that the economic contraction in the region this year will be to the tune of 9.5% of GDP, the biggest since records began, and that it will send the regional economy back to its level of 2010. This, it appears, will be yet another lost decade for Latin America and the Caribbean. In Africa, we are yet to define the effects of the pandemic, partly due to the paucity of information on the spread of the virus and on the country's capacity to address the crisis. All the same, the available estimation points towards an economic contraction of almost 8% of GDP in the smaller African economies. If we come closer to where I am, the EU economy experienced a deep recession this year, despite the considerable fiscal firepower that these affluent countries have been able to deploy to counteract the crisis. GDP here is expected to contract by over 8%. And the same applies to Asia Pacific, the most dynamic region in the global economy. The downturn is expected to be of around 5% of GDP. In sum, we are seeing economic devastation all around, of a scale not seen in most places since the 1930s. Moreover, we have reason to believe that the pandemic will have severe implications for the quality of democracy worldwide, as well as for the achievement of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. We cannot let that the 2030 Agenda Development is not only humanity's best hope of protecting our planet and the inherent dignity of all human beings, but in many respects, this agenda anticipated some of the key elements that should guide national, regional, and global responses to the pandemic today. A pillar of this approach is precisely the implementation of SDG16 plus on peace, justice, and institutions. The crisis we're going through has taught us, in no uncertain terms, that trust in accountable institutions and processes is a fundamental public good. We must protect and invest in good governance, not only for the sake of dealing with the consequences of this pandemic, but in order to the next one. And we have our job cut out for us. As we are convinced that global and regional organizations have an essential role to play in ensuring that we keep strengthening, reforming, and adapting our democratic institutions, rebuild trust, and more resilient societies. They do have a role, and an important one. But if we are to be concrete, how should we get there? How should all of our organizations think about this challenge of rethinking our institutional framework to deal with crises like this? What should better democracies look like the day after this pandemic? Well, they should look like democracies based on a new social code focused on reducing inequality, including gender inequalities, leaving no one behind, especially the most vulnerable ones, and investing in public health, education, job creation, and social protection. Look like democracies with stronger institutions meant to protect the rule of law and the checks and balances, which enhance accountability and transparency mechanisms, and which relentlessly fight corruption and impunity so as to rebuild public trust in democratic institutions. They should look like democracies with stronger parliaments and political parties, capable of deepening deliberative processes and defending spaces for public dialogue and civic participation. They should look like systems capable of investing in technological innovation, inclusion, and network infrastructure so as to engage all stakeholders and actors whose contributions will be indispensable for the success of recovery efforts. They should look like political systems better equipped to cope with the multi-generational challenges of climate change and the sustainable development goals embodied by the 2030 Agenda. Let us be unequivocal about this. Without sustainable democracy, there will not be sustainable development. This is what's called for, and it will not come about on its own. We know by now that democracy is neither created nor maintained by itself. In fact, there's nothing inevitable about democracy. It is something that requires continuous vigilance, dedication, and support. And it also requires collective efforts. If we care as we do about the future of democracy, we need to build global coalitions to protect it. In this framework, the consolidated partnership between the members of the Interregional Dialogue for Democracy, IRDD, provides a great platform for a solution-oriented conversation on the political challenges and opportunities created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Here, we aim to take stock of the experiences of all your organizations and member states and to glean the lessons on what regional and global organizations are able to do to ensure the protection of democratic governance during the pandemic and its reinvention for the day after. I very much look forward to the outcome of this debate and the policy recommendations that can contribute to the definition of action plans which can advance the agenda for sustainable development and more specifically of SDGs16 plus. The year when humanity is facing some of its greatest challenges, it's also celebrating one of its greatest achievements. For the 25th anniversary of the United Nations, we need to stand up and pledge our unwavering commitment to its foundational values and ideals and to the principles of multilateralism so challenged today. Here we are, ready to have this conversation out of a conviction that the multilateral approach embodied by all of our organizations is the only route to deal with the main challenges, some of them existential, that today beset humanity. We are ready to have this conversation because we hope that a renewed international commitment to multilateralism will allow us to build a better world over the next few decades. Because we hope that multilateral efforts are essential, irreplaceable indeed, we want to build a world in which no one will be left behind, in which every human being will have the opportunity to live in peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, in which every person will fully enjoy the fundamental freedoms and rights that are the core of our common human heritage. Such is the size of the hope, such is the size of the challenge, and such must be, therefore, the size of our commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin Casas Samora, the Secretary General for International IDEA, for your very inspiring remarks. You set really the tone for the conversation that we are now going to start with a very interesting set of panelists. I will briefly introduce each of them at the time I'll give them the floor. The first speaker will be Rosalind Nakombe, who is the Chief of Policy, Regional Organizations and Guidance in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs at the United Nations. So, Rosalind, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Thank you for the introduction and really for organizing this meeting, which comes really at an important time as we reflect on where we have been in regard to SDG16 on building peaceful, just societies, but also as we try and look into the future on what is next. I really appreciate the work that has been done by IDEA on this and by the Stimson Center. I have had the advantage of working with International IDEA for many years, both at the UN on elections, but also in my national capacity as a commissioner managing an election within an election management body. So I know the work of IDEA and really appreciate the commitment to governance and to building institutions. You know, Kevin has really started this off in a very high note. I felt as though he's coming up with a very strong critique of the international system, and also going back actually to the basics of the commitment to that. So it's really a very tough path to follow once he has set such a high mark. But I'll try not to defend the international system, but at least to say where we have been for the last 75 years and where we are heading to. Because I think it's important to reflect on that while there are many things that haven't gone right with the international system, with the international order, the fact that we have the UN Charter, which we're celebrating again 75 years this year, those basic elements, those basic principles that governments or member states signed off to are still there. They're still important. That is the non-use of force, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the non-intervention, cooperation, self-determination, and really the sovereign equality of member states. Those form really the foundation of the international relations and remain as relevant today as they were in 1945. Even when among our member states, you might see disagreements on interpretation of some of these principles, generally most of our UN member states have really taken, have adhered to these principles. And that is why we've seen, some remarkable changes in the laws of war to, looking at the political, civil, cultural, and economic and social rights. We've seen lots of work going on around disarmament and the protection of the environment. We've seen a lot of work around peacemaking, which my department spends a lot of time doing, and peacekeeping. But we've also seen how that global system has helped us really bring in the issues of women and other marginalized groups that were not there in 1945. The end of colonialism and the role that the UN had played in ending colonialism and bringing more and more countries into the global body and liberating them from the shackles of colonialism. That's a lot that goes back to what the Charter stood for and what the UN did during that time. So if I'm going back to looking at the theme of today of, what was there, what was done, and where we are, so when you reflect back, there's a lot that the international system, the UN, has done to try and address these things, even with its failures. We've only been able to succeed, obviously, through strong partnership with member states, strong partnerships with regional organizations, and going back to the fact that the UN was able to bring together many countries to agree on the SDGs, and SDG16 being fundamental to that. I think what we see when we've been looking together, when we've been reflecting as a UN on the COVID environment and what we see now, it's really an aggravation of injustices. It's, as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said, it's an X-ray that has been put out to expose the inequalities that have been going on for many years now. It's not COVID that has brought them. They have been exacerbated by COVID. We are able to see those injustices more openly. We are able to see the deficiencies of the systems that we have put in place more openly now. And I think that is why the Secretary General has been very keen to talk about the importance of building back better. And maybe this is where I come back to the second part of the question you asked us to look at on what next? So first, for us, what's next is the importance of really emphasizing again that the foundations, the basic foundations in the Charter, the principles of the Charter still stand. Those ones that are enumerated there, and that it's important for member states to continue reinforcing these principles and agree on actually how to implement and move forward with them. But it's no longer enough to just deal with only the member states and governments. It's important to build more social capital, and that requires us moving beyond the ruling elite, moving beyond elite agreements on governance to broadening political participation. And I think that is what you see from all the political missions that the UN has, whether you're looking at our work in Syria, or you're looking at our work in Yemen, or you're looking at our work in Somalia. It is all about trying to make sure that we are broadening the political participation. We're bringing in more women to participate. We're bringing in more young people to participate because this is about their future. So it's really about expanding the elite agreements to broaden the political participation of all. And obviously, civil society plays a very key role in that. I think the second aspect that we'll bring in is really what we've seen, the need to not only build on our existing tools that we have, but come up with new tools, because the tools that were established 75 years ago, yes, they're still important, but they still need to be reworked a bit or retooled to be able to address the current situations that we find ourselves in. That is, for instance, why within the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs, we've come up with things like the Climate and Security Mechanism, because we're trying to look at the link between climate change and peace and security, and ensuring that we have these new tools that try and address them. Or we're looking at tools such as our innovation cell that was recently established within the department to also look at these issues of peacemaking, mediation from a broader perspective, and looking at how we can use innovation to try and really address the challenges that we face today. One of the other things that we've been doing, the third one, is really changing our analytical lens, that because understanding that with COVID-19, we are not just looking at the political processes, and that if you're going to try and address the issues or the impact of COVID-19 in building peaceful societies and just societies, you're going to have to look at the development side also. And so we're working very closely with our resident coordinators in all the countries through peace and development advisors that we deploy in those offices to try and bring the social and economic angle to it, so that when you're looking and you're doing your political work, you're doing the political work, you're supporting societies, but you're looking at it holistically through this analytical lens that you're brought in. And lastly, it's really deepening the partnership with regional organizations and other bodies. And that's why Secretary General Guterres has been talking a lot about networked multilateralism, where he sees regional organizations as really fundamental to the work of building societies to be stronger and more resilient. And that is why some of our strongest partners will be my former employer, the African Union, whom we have to work very closely with in the African continent. He's working very closely with OAS in the Americas. It's working with ASEAN. And so we recognize the importance of really deepening this partnership with regional organizations. And obviously, the last one, which I can't emphasize and overemphasize more, is having more international cooperation, not less international cooperation. We as the United Nations believe very strongly that we cannot succeed if our member states are not united and not working together, do not have consensus towards any issue. So in our view, if we put all this together, these different points together, we have a chance.
Jocelyn, may I ask you to conclude because you have exhausted your time. Thank you.
I was actually concluding to say that if we are able to put all these things together, we at least have a fighting chance to be able to build stronger and just and peaceful societies. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Jocelyn, and sorry to putting some pressure on you, but we have a limited time and you made very, very important points. There will be an opportunity to get back to each panelist with the Q&A session after the presentations are over. The next speaker is my colleague and friend, Armand Bekai, who is a Senior Program Officer, Democracy Assessment and Policy Analysis Unit in International Ideas Global Program. Armand, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Massimo. Dear participants and colleagues, it is my pleasure to be speaking at this event that aims to take stock on the results achieved and challenges still facing the implementation of SDG16+, as well as the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In my presentation, I will aim to share some of the main findings of our latest In Focus brief, which just came out yesterday, which is on the progress of SDG16 targets from International Ideas Global State of Democracy perspective. Allow me to share a PowerPoint presentation with all of you.
Needless to say, Armand, this is being counted as your time, eh?
Yes, I know. Yes. I hope you see the slides now. Right? So, International Idea maintains that democracy has an instrumental value and as such is an enabler of sustainable development. This conviction is shared with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs framework. The UN's vision of governance and democracy and the SDG16 targets stand in fusion with International Ideas' own conceptualization of democracy, which is based on two fundamental principles: popular control over decision-making and political equality among those exercising that control. And then stemming from this definition, International Idea has developed a global state of democracy, or a GSOD, set of indices around the following aspects of the conceptual framework, which is in front of you. And they revolve around representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. And now, in terms of the main findings, in order to monitor progress on SDG16 targets, the global state of democracy indices measure the number of countries with significant gains and declines in 18 global state of democracy aspects between the baseline year of 2015 and 2019 as the cutoff point for the latest global state of democracy indices data. In general, global progress on SDG16 is facing significant challenges according to our findings, although some advances are also noted. Out of the 18 global state of democracy aspects that track progress on SDG16, significant declines overshadow gains both globally and regionally. To make sense of this table that you have in front of you, I will just give you a quick overview regionally. Africa has recorded considerable gains, particularly around our aspects of personal integrity and security, absence of corruption, and social group equality. According to our data, serious challenges remain, especially on aspects related to targets 7 and 10 of SDG 16. The Middle East has recorded very few consequential gains, such as some progress on access to justice. It remains, though, the region with the lowest performance on SDG 16 targets overall. Latin America and the Caribbean have made some progress on effective parliament, judicial independence, and absence of corruption. However, on most aspects, particularly those related to targets 7 and 10, there is overall decline. North America has noted overall stagnation or decline in all global state of democracy aspects, although from generally high or mid-range levels of performance. Asia and the Pacific have made considerable progress on global state of democracy aspects of absence of corruption, access to justice, effective parliament, and clean elections. Most declines, however, are noted under aspects related to targets 10 of SDG 16. Europe has recorded some gains, more gains than declines on electoral participation, for instance, but more declines than gains on targets 1, 3, 6, 7, and 10 of SDG 16. In addition to our global state of democracy indices, International IDEA has also developed a project in partnership with the European Union titled The Global Monitor of COVID-19's Impact on Democracy and Human Rights, which is a qualitative online monitoring tool of democracy and human rights implications of measures adopted by governments around the world in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, specifically in the 162 countries included in our global state of democracy indices. By way of general finding, the COVID-19 global crisis is resulting in numerous cases of potential or de facto infringements of civil liberties, as well as clean elections. The monitor also reports that there have been alleged or confirmed reports of excessive police force to impose COVID-19 restrictions in at least 30 countries. The measures have also resulted in many instances of election delays or elections taking place despite the risks posed by the pandemic. There are numerous cases of assaults on people's personal integrity and security, the government-sanctioned mobile phone apps being used for contract tracing, with potential ramifications for privacy and the risk of personal data being used for political purposes other than fighting the pandemic. The data from the Global Monitor also shows that as of the end of July 2020, more than half of the countries that we cover have implemented measures to curb COVID-19 or have experienced developments during the pandemic that have presented concerns from a democracy and human rights perspective. The developments, in short, during 2020 will likely lead to the SDG 16 targets experiencing some debilitating impacts. Although it is still early to make definitive judgments, the emerging data that we have from this monitor depicts a worrying trends that will most likely have an impact on areas such as civil liberties, civil society participation, and clean elections. This means that the likelihood that we will be witnessing quite stark and precipitous declines across a number of SDG 16 targets for 2020 and possibly beyond is unfortunately quite high. Now, in terms of the policy recommendations, as my last slide, and also as a lesson learned from the challenges that I explained above, our first recommendation has to do with democracy assistance post-COVID-19 should make the case for democracy, the better linkages, this nexus between economic and social development that also the Secretary General mentioned earlier. Rebuilding better and more inclusive societies post-COVID-19 should include focusing on delivery of democracy from the perspective of democracy practitioners and such as ourselves. Political economy analysis should underpin recovery efforts, And also there's a clear case that we should document and provide support for democratic innovations in the North and South across the globe. And that is, in short, my presentation. And I think I have just about completed this within the time frame given. Thank you very much.
Armand, excellent. Thank you very much. You provided us with some facts and figures on trends, following the very good presentation by Roslyn, who provided us an overview about principles and what the UN is doing. The next speaker is Patricia Galdames, Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies. So, Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Massimo, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today and talking about this very important aspect of how to reinvent this role of international and regional organizations in the midst of what we're living right now with the pandemic. Maybe I want to stop and there's a lot of facts and figures that were just provided by the colleagues before me, but let me stop and perhaps speak a bit about the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think since the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, we all knew that the implementation of the SDGs required the meaningful participation, coordination, and collaboration between all of the stakeholders at all levels, including government, civil society, private sector, and others. This cross-collaboration and multi-stakeholder partnerships that bring together diverse expertise and resources are certainly needed to increase impact and ensure much needed progress along the lines of all of the SDGs in this decade of action, and especially now as we address the effects of COVID-19. The Community of Democracies understands this important. Its mission to support democratic institutions and promote democratic values is enshrined in the Warsaw Declaration and is firmly anchored in the 2030 Agenda as well. For the past 4 years, the community has been working extensively to promote the implementation and monitoring of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, especially regarding Goal 16, Goal 5 on gender equality, and Goal 17 on partnerships. Using its multi-stakeholder platform, we bring together governments and civil society. The community has promoted discussions on the SDGs at its governing council meetings, including on the role of the private sector in the implementation. It passed a statement last year on democracy in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, where we underscored the importance of engaging with the private sector and also civil society to further sustainable development. We've had in past years regional discussions also on Goal 5 and the importance of ensuring women's full and effective participation, which is, and I cannot underscore this more, how important it is to include women when we talk about all of these issues. We actually did this together with International IDEA a few years ago. But we have learned that making progress is not often easy. It really does require the system of alliances amongst like-minded organizations and concerted action to achieve the SDGs. And this year, due to COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we have been moving some things around. We have had to adapt, for example, some of the Asia Democracy Forums the community has been holding for the past few years. This time we're actually going to hold this year's Kathmandu Democracy Forum online. And additionally, we're planning to provide assistance to civil society in Asia, aiming at building their capacity to assess and conduct research to produce human rights-based SDG16 monitoring reports that will take into account the COVID-19 crisis. These reports are actually going to be presented and discussed in this online Kathmandu Democracy Forum that will take place later next month. Just like the community, I think it's important to note that there are several multi-stakeholder initiatives and partnerships at both the global and regional levels that have been doing a lot of good work in advancing the implementation of Goal 16 and related targets for the past 4 or 5 years. And these initiatives and partnerships have certainly played an important role in helping channel international political, technical, and financial support to implementers at the national level. They have also helped sharing good practices and implementation and incorporation of SDG16 into national level policies and budgets. An example of this is, for example, what we have been doing, collaborating in the past few years with International IDEA, working together to enable spaces for these key stakeholders to have these open conversations on the 2030 agenda, and especially on Goal 16, like we're doing right now. I think to overcome, just to go back to some of the questions that bring us into this conversation, to overcome this negative impact of COVID-19, and trying to look at how we can uplift this multilateral action and bolster development in the next coming years. I think we need to keep in mind that while we're trying to keep our communities safe, we still cannot lose sight of the goals in this decade of action, and especially in Goal 16, as was mentioned by the Secretary General of International IDEA. International solidarity and continued cooperation among governments, civil society, the private sector, and everyone is more necessary than ever. I think in the last 7 months, we have all learned, as I said before, to adapt and continue working during this challenging time. And this is precisely what we need to do to move forward with the UN Sustainable Development Agenda and Goal 16 right now. And in doing so, again, I think it's important to keep in mind the importance of ensuring the participation of everyone so we don't leave anyone behind. And especially, of course, I refer to women, to youth, to the inclusion of civil society as we move forward and build back better. The community of democracies is precisely doing this right now. We just yesterday, we had a very interesting event to discuss the importance of women's political participation and involvement in decision-making during COVID-19 pandemic and its recovery efforts. And we had the opportunity to hear from women leaders who actually discussed strategies and experiences in leading in the pandemic, highlighting once more this very critical role of women in the front lines of the crisis. And like I said before, also in moving forward with the entire Sustainable Development Agenda. We already started also an initiative on the ground with Westminster Democracy Foundation that also seeks to support women political and civic leaders through a series of practical workshops on leadership and effective communication in the Gambia that we're gonna do, of course, remotely due to the pandemic. Like I said before, we're producing and we're assisting civil society along the lines of producing this important reports on SDG16 in Asia, and we'll be holding that event. And on youth empowerment, I think that's another very important issue that we cannot leave behind, talking about youth inclusion when we're speaking about all these issues. We have been working as well this year, and we launched a social media campaign involving youth leaders from across the world to revitalize and promote the principles of the Warsaw Declaration. And we have been talking as well about the importance of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And just one more thing I'd like to add.
Yes, Patty,
I think it's important
please
to
wind up.
Yes,
thank you.
I think it will be digital technology and cooperation in this area, especially right now as we move forward with the agenda. The Community of Democracies just a few days ago recently established a working group on democracy and technology. And I'll leave it at that, but I think it's a very important discussion that we also need to have in moving ahead and accelerating this implementation of Goal 16 as we build back better.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Again, a very important contribution, stressing also the importance of partnerships in addressing these issues together. The next speaker is Francisco Guerrero, Secretary for the Strengthening of Democracy in the Organization of American States. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Thank you for all your help during this event. I would like to thank, first of all, the leadership of International IDEA. A special saludo to my friend Kevin Casas. Good to see you, Kevin, again. Kevin has always been a very close partner with the Organization of American States. He was a member of the organization, so he knows all the challenges that we're facing here in the continent. The degree to which the COVID-19 pandemic impacted us is, as it has been said, of a scale rarely seen. It has tested out our strengths and highlighted our weaknesses. In this context, the states of the Americas have deployed their best efforts to respond to the crisis according to their specific realities and to protect their peoples. In the face of this emergency, democratic principles, values, and mechanisms continue to be the best way to find legitimate and consensual responses to overcome the crisis caused by the pandemic. Only democracy can guarantee a long-term recovery and at the same time strengthen freedoms, values, institutions, and of course, the protection of citizens' rights. The Organization of American States, as the main political forum of the hemisphere, has adapted to these new challenges through a series of initiatives and efforts to effectively respond to the crisis. Some of these efforts include the deployment in June of the first electoral observation mission in the Americas during COVID-19 pandemic for the general elections in Suriname, and the subsequent deployment of a more robust group of specialists and observers for the general elections in the Dominican Republic in July. The OAS, through its Department of Electoral Cooperation and Observation, developed a hybrid methodology which utilizes both virtual engagement with the stakeholders and in-person meetings on the ground. Strict precautionary measures, which include the use of personal protective equipment and social distancing, were implemented for all in-person encounters. Similarly, in July, the OAS published the Guide to Organizing Elections in Times of Pandemic with the collaboration of the Pan American Health Organization. The OAS compiled a series of measures for the holding of safe, clean, and transparent elections while contributing to a reduced risk of COVID-19 transmissions. Moreover, the OAS published the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a guide to political action to address the COVID-19 pandemic. The guide seeks to promote the functionality and validity of democratic principles as essential and effective elements to advance amid the challenges caused by the pandemic, especially in the new phase of the economic recovery and progressive social restoration. The guide is based on the concept that democratic mechanisms are the most appropriate way to address the pandemic and its consequences. As part of the OAS effort to continue offering its member states opportunities to discuss and share experiences, best practices, knowledge, and lessons learned through digital resources, the Secretariat for Strengthening Democracy organized the first virtual meeting of presidents of legislative powers. This meeting was conceived to activate and innovate model and timely dialogue for the creation of new spaces and agreements that guarantee the rule of law, protection of civic health, and efficient economic and social recovery for a more inclusive, digital, and sustainable development. As a result, a plan of action was subscribed confronting the challenges democracy faces during the pandemic. In the framework of the coronavirus crisis and in compliance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals number 16, the Department of the Promotion of Peace of the OAS has been adapting and refocusing its priorities toward activities that lead to guaranteeing a peaceful, just, and more harmonious coexistence within the societies of the OAS member states. To achieve this objective, we are promoting the learning of values and practices linked to a democratic political culture, training young citizens in ethical principles and values, offering seminars and courses on the techniques and tools of modern political activity, and preserving the institutional memory in terms of peace building and conflict resolution. The Department for the Promotion of Peace is also working to raise the voice of national governments in the hemispheric dialogue, and they best know and understand the challenges that the communities faces. Strengthening democratic institutions is key to responding in a timely and effective manner to citizens during the pandemic. Local institutions play an important role in reaching the most remote and economically disadvantaged places. The OAS has also responded to other aspects of the crisis. The International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador deployed a team of 30 multidisciplinary specialists to implement an audit and a follow-up mechanism that oversees the use of public funds to tackle the national emergency caused by the pandemic. Within the framework of the Community-Driven Development Project in Haiti, more than 3,500 temporary workers were hired within the purpose of promoting awareness about COVID-19 and sanitizing different areas of Port-au-Prince. In addition, the OAS signed alliances with MIT, Harvard, and Digicel to promote the use of COVID Safe Paths mobile application. The OAS mission for the Belize Guatemala process prepared and implemented an awareness campaign specifically addressed to the communities of the adjacency zone to reduce the risk of transmissions of COVID-19. Last but not least, the mission to support the peace process in Colombia, the MAP, made all the necessary arrangements to keep offering support and technical assistance to the Colombian communities and institutions during the pandemic. Throughout the quarantine, the mission received more than 257 requests for humanitarian assistance. In order to strengthen the MAP's virtual presence in the territories where peace policy topics are a priority, the mission established an alliance with community radios and changed the way they perform their monitoring and verification duties through a remote methodology that allows them to maintain the connection with the communities. Last week, on September 11th, was the 19th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And this past Tuesday, September the 15th, as we all know, was the International Day of Democracy. In these times of pandemic, defending the effective observance and relevance of democratic values is, as Kevin mentioned, a high priority. The Inter-American Democratic Charter represents a roadmap for the consolidation of political freedoms, economic development, and social coexistence, which are essential to the well-being of the people in these difficult times experienced in the region. Countries.
May I invite you to conclude, Francisco, please?
My last paragraph. This is my last paragraph.
Thank you.
Countries have a better chance of recovering from these exceptional circumstances caused by conflicts, natural disasters, and health emergency when there is a solid democratic basis, strong state institutions, a clear separation of powers, and increased possibility for citizens to exercise their rights, enhanced transparency, full observance of human rights, freedom of the press, access to information, and unconditional adherence to the rule of law and constitutional order. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a ti, Francisco. Thank you for your presentation. And before I give the floor to the next speaker, I wanted to share with all attendees a communication that comes from the Stimson Center, the organizers, and that is that there will be 5 more forum sessions that will commence in about half an hour. That is at noon New York time. So please consider that these sessions on the day 3 of the Global Forum will start at noon New York time. Thank you very much, Francisco. You made references to normative frameworks and also to some country cases, country situations. We heard something similar also from Roslyn and Patricia. Now I would like to give the floor to my good friend Jabele Mathlosa, Director for Political Affairs at the African Union Commission. Jabele, you have the floor.
Of 3. Am I audible?
Yes, I can see the presentation.
But you can hear me also, Massimo?
Yes, I can see the presentation and I can hear your voice. You can go ahead, Jabele.
Thank you so much. Just to appreciate this occasion, because for me, three celebrations in one. We are celebrating 75 years of the UN. We're also celebrating 25th anniversary of the International Idea. And as you'll recall, and other colleagues have already said this, Massimo, that 3 days ago, we're commemorating the International Day of Democracy. So I think it's worth celebrating. But of course, we are celebrating under very awkward conditions of COVID-19. So I'm bringing you perspectives from Africa, from the African Union, and I'm going to stick to our time of 7 minutes, and I'll speak to only those 4 issues that we can see on the screen. So let's start first with the vision for Africa. Is the screen? I want to make sure that you can see it. Let's start first with the Massimo, that we have the African vision for democracy, peace, and development on our continent is captured in our long-term development vision, long-term development blueprint called Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And in that, we also have a specific reference to democracy, which is aspiration 3 of Agenda 2063, which envisages an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. And that is also complemented by an aspiration that speaks to peace and security on the continent, aspiration 4, that envisions a peaceful and secure Africa. And let's then link this to global normative frameworks. Globally, the vision for democracy, peace, and development is articulated in the 2030 Global Agenda on Sustainable Development, as other colleagues have said before me. And both aspirations 3 and 4 of Agenda 2063 that I've talked to earlier on dovetail neatly into the Sustainable Development Goal number 16. And that goal, SDG number 16, aims to, I quote, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, inclusive institutions at all levels. I think we know that. And therefore, under the conditions that we're concerned about of COVID, let's recall that this year, the African Union had declared this year as the year of silencing the guns, creating conducive conditions for Africa's development. We're going to focus mainly on conflict prevention, management, and resolution. That is now being compounded by terrorism and intercommunal violence across the continent. And now COVID-19 has complicated all this in a big way, because conflicts still continue. As we focus our eyes on COVID-19, terrorism still is on the upsurge, and intercommunal violence, farmers fighting against herders in many parts of the continent, in particular the Sahel region, is a problem. Just to remind ourselves that in March 2020, the UN Secretary General and the African Union Chair, the Chair of the African Union Commission, made an important clarion call for a global ceasefire in all conflict hotspots on the continent. And it was a very important call, but be that as it may, this conflict still persists. And I've just given a list of the hotspots on the continent on the bullet points there. The Sahel Belt, the Central Africa and the Great Lakes region, the Lake Chad Basin, the Horn of Africa, the Maghreb region, including the raging war in Libya. And in fact, for a long period of time, Southern Africa was considered as the most stable region. No, not anymore. We are also seeing terrorist insurgency in the northern province of Mozambique called Cabo Delgado. So no part of the continent is safe today. Now, let me share with you, as I brought to the close, let me share with you some of the interesting insights coming from a project we're undertaking, the African Union and International Idea. It's called Governance Response to COVID-19 in Africa. In fact, the full title is Sustainable Governance Response to COVID-19 in Africa. Very interesting project. Now, I'm going to share with you only 5 elements that we're covering and see what's come up on the continent. One area is human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Here, what the finding is that emergency measures that have been put in place by a number of African countries are constraining human rights, access to justice, and the rule of law in a big way. And these are emergency responses to COVID, by the way. Let's remember. Now, here is the result. The result is that human rights abuses by security forces are on the have been on the increase, because the security forces have been deployed as part of lockdown, and they have been abusing rights of citizens massively. And we've also seen curtailment of media freedom. That's number one. Number two, on public service, here is the problem. Lockdowns have constrained delivery of public services, including water, electricity, education, healthcare, etc., etc. Now, the result is the weakening of the social contract between governments and citizens. And this is a big problem. Social contract is declining rapidly. And we are then seeing the weak social contract, popular protests emerging. Three, accountability and responsiveness. The problem is that over-centralization of power in the executive and the weakening of other arms of government, the legislature and the judiciary, are getting weakened and weakened all the time. And we're also seeing skyrocketing COVID-19 related corruption because of emergency procurement. And then the controls then get relaxed. And then there's massive corruption to COVID-19 now. And there's declining public trust in governance institutions. Democracy and constitutionalism. The problem here is that we had more than 20 elections and referenda scheduled on the continent. Now, the calendar has been disrupted, and some countries have gone ahead elections with no international observers, low voter turnout, and in some instances, conflict, including the usurpation of power, military usurpation of power in Mali by the military recently. And also, we have instances where elections have been postponed, and we have seen political polarization on a massive scale, like where I am here. I'm talking to you from Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia now, where the election has been postponed. And we have seen conflict, also constitutional crisis, as to then what happens to when the tenure of the current administration. Finally, humanitarian assistance. This is an important area. It may look distant, but it's very relevant because on the continent today, we have 27 million displaced persons, and these are 19.2 million internally displaced persons and 7.8 million refugees. This is massive. And these are some of the hardest hit social groups by COVID-19, including the response itself. And most of these are also excluded in policy responses to COVID-19. And the result is accentuation of stigmatization, discrimination, and xenophobia. Now, this is an interesting insight from the work we're doing with the International IDEA over there in Addis Ababa. And in conclusion, now, concrete action. The AU is now, and we're inviting our colleagues who are on this platform, on the panel, to help us here. We are now in the process working with the International IDEA and the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, ISA in Johannesburg. We are working on the guidelines, the AU African Union guidelines on elections during COVID-19 and other public health emergencies. And I'm making a clarion call to this platform to help us with the ideas how to fine-tune this. We want to have this approved by the AU policy organs before end of the year, so that by beginning of 2021, it gets used by our member states that are going to hold elections in that year. Thank you so much, Massimo. Sorry, I hope I didn't take too long.
No, thank you very much, Jabele. You provided also interesting parallels to the presentation on Latin America made by Francisco Guerrero on the focus on developing guidelines for elections during COVID-19, and also addressed some specific case at the country level. Now, I would like to give the floor to the next speaker, who is Tang Siu Moon, Director of the Political and Security Directorate of ASEAN. You have the floor.
Thank you, Massimo. Good morning and good evening, Excellencies, friends and colleagues, and warm greetings from the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, Indonesia. I join my colleagues in congratulating the International IDEA UN for the very important milestones of the 25th and 27th anniversaries, and also, of course, we welcome the celebration of the International Day of Democracy. I share a lot of the views presented by my fellow panelists an hour ago. I was thinking, instead of perhaps repeating or reinforcing the points made, maybe I could turn the table round to perhaps give a different perspective. If there is ever one silver lining of COVID, in the sense that how has ASEAN responded to COVID and what is the impact on our near future and also our more long-term trend. Needless to say, COVID is a life changer in the sense that it has changed our lives, the way we organize ourselves. It has changed the regional organization. But one thing that has not changed much as far as multilateralism is concerned in the region is that we hear perspectives from other regions that be more nationalism and less multilateralism. But in Southeast Asia, we find that there is in fact a parallel track where the national response is important, but nevertheless, we do expect the multilateral track, to step up and to do more, in fact. And we see the urging from the people of Southeast Asia and the people of ASEAN in asking that ASEAN could do more as a sign of their support and also for their expectation for ASEAN to step up. That is intra-regionally. From an external perspective, we see our dialogue partners, including the UN, engaging with the region in the first place, sharing information and subsequently sharing PPEs, financial assistance, It's not just a one-way track. A number of ASEAN member states are also supporting the clinical trial, the third stage clinical trial as well. So there is a two-way cooperation between ASEAN and our dialogue partners, our external partners as well. And we are happy to share that fingers crossed by November, we will see the conclusion of the long-awaited regional comprehensive economic partnership, where we'll see one of the largest, if not the largest, trade pact in the world in that sense. So we do see that perhaps Southeast Asia may be one of the an oasis for multilateralism, where it brings people together to foster more cooperation. This does not say that the national perspective is not important. It is, but multilateral track is alive and well in Southeast Asia. Let me go to the three points which I see perhaps is quite important to point out with regard to the impact of COVID-19 on the region. Number one, we do see that the impact is the enhancement of digitalization. Our colleagues have mentioned that in other parts of the region has also turned to digitalization. We are aware that in Southeast Asia there is different degrees of economy development. For phone, for example, the world is talking about 5G, but there are some societies and some corners of Southeast Asia where just introducing 3G in that sense. So we have a range from countries that are ready to run with 5G technology, but there are others who may be working on 2G and 3G network in that sense. So for us to embrace, warmly, digitalization is a big step. Of course, with COVID, it is a necessity. This is the push that COVID has provided us to move forth with digitalization, not just in e-commerce, not just in the commercial world, but also in education as well, and more importantly in health. As we know, in the contact tracing, digitalization plays a very important role. So digitalization is a factor that we cannot ignore, and it will be even stronger and gain stronger support in the regional agenda. Second point is human security. As in all parts of the other region, that when we think of security, it's usually a traditional perspective, traditional military security, territorial security. I think COVID-19 has sensitized to us is that there are other enemies out there. There are other insidious enemy, i.e. germs, diseases, and so on. And the pandemic clearly amplifies that. The impact to the individual, to the economy, to the society, it is far widespread in that sense. So there is a change of mindset, or there's a changing of the mindset that we need to rethink our approach to security per se. perhaps if this mindset gains traction, we may see more investment in other aspects of society, such as health, such as education, and other aspects that can make society more resilient to future pandemics, but also to climate change, to other threats that is on the horizon that will impact individuals and communities, and not necessarily territorial defense in that sense. The third point is something that ASEAN has been working on for quite some time, which is cross-sectoral and cross-pillar cooperation. As you know, ASEAN is organized, our cooperation is organized along three primary pillars, which is political security, economic, and social cultural, hence the three pillars. There is, I think, a valid criticism that we tend to work in a silo mentality where the economists will work in the economic perspective, and then us in the political security realm, we will work among ourselves, but rarely do we fertilize, the synergy between all the other three pillars. Again, I think COVID-19 brought to the fore that we cannot work alone. No man is an island. If we continue to see COVID-19 as a health issue, I think we are missing a big part of the picture, because the economic ramifications, and we have discussed today, the political ramifications is also huge in that sense. Is it a chicken and the egg problem? It can be, we can debate, but what we do realize that everything is interrelated, interconnected in that sense. Hence, the impact of cross-pillar, cross-sectoral cooperation would be here to stay. Just let me end on perhaps the next 1 minute on just to highlight the measures that ASEAN is taking to address this pandemic. We're currently working on the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, which would also include elements on human rights, on disabled people, the special needs, and so on, with working with businesses here. So it is not just economic per se, there'll be a health component. It is a all-encompassing, holistic, comprehensive approach to making ASEAN, firstly, to reopen the region, second, to recover, and third, how to foster resiliency in the region. We also established a COVID-19 response fund. We're discussing a ASEAN travel corridor arrangement. We are soon going to be implementing a regional reserve of military supplies. We hope that when all these things are implemented, fully, it will sustain society resilience, and that would also have a spill effect, a direct spill effect to democratization, and also the enhancement of human rights in the region. Thank you very, very much. And I look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Tang Siew Moon. You provided a very convincing argument about looking at issues in a comprehensive and coherent manner across different pillars of your work. Next is the final panelist for today, who is Max Gilbert, focal point for the SDGs and senior advisor for external relations in the Council of Europe. So, Max, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear?
Yes, I can, and I can also see you. Go ahead.
Great, wonderful. So first of all, I thank International IDEA, and in particular you, Massimo, and my friend Luis, for this timely initiative. It's a pleasure to be back working with International IDEA, even if it's only in virtual format this time. The Council of Europe is a regional organization aimed first and foremost at promoting the respect of human rights, rule of law, and democracy among its member states at all times and in all circumstances. The current pandemic, like other crises and emergencies, is no exception. Most definitely, the most important human right is the right to life. And thus, we could but welcome the swift and decisive actions by member states to prevent and mitigate the pandemic. At the same time, our Secretary General stated that while the virus is resulting in the tragic loss of life, we must nonetheless prevent it from destroying our way of life, our understanding of who we are, what we value, and the rights to which every European is entitled. The Council of Europe has demonstrated on other crisis occasions, such as the fight against terrorism, our philosophy is that the spread of COVID-19 and the promotion of the fight against the spread of COVID-19 and the promotion of our common values are not incompatible, but rather complementary. With a view to assisting member states in ensuring that the measures taken by authorities remain proportionate to the threat proposed by the virus and are limited in time, the Secretary General published a document in early April entitled Respecting Democracy, Rule of Law and Human Rights in the Framework of COVID Crisis, a toolkit for member states. This document covers four main areas: derogations from the European Convention on Human Rights in times of emergency, respect for the rule of law and democratic principles in times of emergency, including limits on the scope and duration of such measures, fundamental human rights standards, including freedom of expression, privacy and data protection, protection of vulnerable groups from discrimination, and the right to education, and fourthly, protection from crime and the protection of victims of crime, in particular with regards to gender-based violence. In addition, the annual report of the Secretary General, Multilateralism 2020, was published in June and largely focuses on the Council of Europe's reaction and adaptation of its work, both vis-à-vis member states and internally, in the light of the pandemic. The annual report indeed outlines extensively the organization's wide range of responses, and I invite you to consult the document, which can be found on our website, and I can share with you the link after the meeting. However, let me at this stage give you some examples. The European Committee of Social Rights adopted a statement of interpretation on the right to the protection of health in accordance with the European Social Charter, Article 11, in times of pandemic. It endorsed many measures adopted by member states in response to the crisis and announced the preparation of a further statement covering a broader range of social rights, such as the health and safety at work, rights of children and older persons. A website has been created to provide relevant information and guidance to authorities on the role of media in the current context and how they should be protected. The chair of the Committee of the Convention for the Protection of Individuals with regard to automatic processing of personal data and the Data Protection Commissioner of the organization issued a joint declaration reminding stakeholders responsible for the fight against the pandemic that data protection standards are fully compatible and with fundamental rights, such as public health, and that these should be applied to the use of data analytics and digital technologies deployed in the context of the current pandemic. The European Commission for Democracy Through Law, otherwise known as the Venice Commission, which has enjoyed a number of contacts with International IDEA, released a report entitled Respect for Democracy, Human Rights and the Rule of Law During States of Emergency, which elaborates on the principles, conditions and necessary guarantees which should be observed during the crisis, including the issue of holding or postponing elections. Turning to the statutory bodies of the Council of Europe, from early April, all meetings of the Committee of Ministers' Deputies were held by written procedure or by video conference. In June, physical meetings resumed, and the 13th session of the Committee of Ministers, i.e. the ministerial session, originally foreseen in May, was postponed until the 4th of November, and this will take place subject to further COVID-related developments. The Parliamentary Assembly did not hold its April or June sessions. However, arrangements have been made for the conduct of remote committee meetings. At the Assembly, a number of reports are under preparation of relevance to the pandemic, such as a report on democracies facing the pandemic and the impact of COVID-19 on human rights and the rule of law. The European Court of Human Rights has continued to fulfill its mandate by ensuring the continuity of its activities and delivering judgments electronically and by relaxing certain time limits for applicants. The Congress of Local and Regional Authorities cancelled its March session, but has continued remote meetings at presidential and committee levels. The Commissioner for Human Rights has released thematic recommendations to member states, highlighting the need for human rights compliant responses to the pandemic, and drew attention to the high risk of contagion in prisons, advocating the use of all available alternatives to detention whenever possible. And finally, at the level of the Secretariat of the organization, although most staff are now back in their offices, At the peak of the restrictions, at headquarters and in external field offices, well over 80% of staff were working remotely, and some 450 video conferences were being conducted each day with around 2,000 internal and external participants. This experience will feed into the upcoming reform process, which will examine the working methods of the Secretariat. Thank you very much for your attention, Massimo.
Thank you very much, Max. We have very little time now for the Q&A. We had a very interesting and rich conversation. I would like to add from Rosalind from the UN that also the UN has just finalized a guide on elections during COVID. So Rosalind Nakombe is in fact inviting to share all these tools that have been produced by regional organizations and the UN. I will make just a very quick summary of the many questions that were already posted in the chat and give any of you the opportunity to get back. I will have to be selective. We don't have much time. So there was a question which was posed by Adam Carroll on vaccine justice. So how can we, the UN, effectively oppose the monopolization of COVID-19 vaccines, which is something that may happen. There was a question from the YouTube actually, which was about what is the work done in the Americas around the migration crisis in the region during the COVID-19 pandemic and how this will affect the stability, peace, and development in the region. Another question was about the role of civil society when the space for civil society is closed or shrinking. The example was made by Mohammed Haq, who referred to the case of Bangladesh. And then there is again another question on Myanmar and respect for the global ceasefire. So what could a regional organization like ASEAN do in order to make sure that this call is turned into practice? So there are many questions. I'm aware that there are only 4 minutes, and I invite you to provide really tweets in responses as depends on your respective regions or your organizational focus. Who wants to start?
I can start if you want, Massimo.
Yes, please. Go ahead, Francisco.
I'm going to be very brief because I know that we're running short, and I want to be very concise. I think the issue about the vaccine justice, it's extremely relevant, not only for Latin America, but for all the regions. I think as we state that democracy should be for all, vaccines also should be for all. I guess that there's a democratic principle involved here, and this is something that is being discussed not only within the OAS, but also in all the regional organizations. I guess that the role that the World Health Organization is going to have here is going to be extremely important. In reference to what's happening in the Americas, I think during my speech I gave an overview of many practical things that we're doing, but I would add just something else. As we speak, elections keep happening, and we're going to have an electoral mission in Bolivia, October the 18th, and I think to carry on with our responsibilities, particularly on the field, on the ground, is one of the things that regional organizations can contribute to, and I would leave it there because we're just planning how to carry out this mission in Bolivia, and it's good that not only this mission in Bolivia, but the following that will come next year, when I have a very, very heavy electoral calendar, will continue. I think that's something that shows that we're quite active in this field. I would leave it there.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Any other feedback or responses from panelists? Perhaps from other regions? Yes, please go ahead.
Maybe if I come in just very quickly, Massimo, on just assuring on behalf of the UN that the Secretary General has been very strong on issues of injustice. He has said very clearly that it's a public good and that it should be made public to all. And he has brought together a team that is pushing hard on that. And you will see when he speaks to the General Assembly during its opening, he's going to make that speech very strong on the importance of ensuring that that public good is made available to all.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. The vaccine will be a public good. And as many of you actually said, also trust in public institutions is another public good that we are all trying to preserve, protect, and in some cases rebuild. We have only 1 minute left, so unless there are other panelists who want to get back really with a very short reply, I will apologize to all those who presented the questions. Actually, there are more questions, but we can't really go beyond noon, as I said at the beginning. I'm very sorry for this. I will provide you with just my key takeaway from this conversation. You have been witnessing an exchange in a series of dialogues that we have started all together on this issue. And we are now addressing the context, the particular context of the implementing the SDG agenda at the COVID-19 time. We have seen that we are all developing knowledge tools. We saw the analysis about facts and figures, very important. Policy should be driven by evidence. We are all developing tools that may help practitioners implement their activities at the time of COVID-19. The example of the guides on how to carry out elections at this particular critical time is an example. We are all reshaping our approaches by taking into account the critical issues that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, reference to fragilities, conflict, vulnerabilities, issues related to gender inequality, other forms of inequalities. And we have continued to engage in this conversation because that is one of the things we find relevant. We'll continue to do so, and we'll get back to you through our channels, through our work. Please stay tuned. This is going to stay with us for some time, and I'm pretty sure that it will depend on all of us and our joint partnerships if we'll provide answers to this very, very critical crisis. Thank you to all the panelists for their contributions to today's conversation. Thank you to the Stimson Center for co-hosting this initiative, and I think we can conclude our conversation of today. Thank you to all.